We'll start with our intros first, and then we'll hand it over to you folks. But yeah, just to get started, so this event is run in partnership between Startup Zone, Planet Hatch, and Ignite. So I'm going to run through some quick intros of what all of us do. And then Sebastian, who is here from Ignite, is going to introduce you to the pod starter folks and get the event started. So yeah, right off the bat, Planet Hatch is an entrepreneurship center located in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Planet Hatch develops globally competitive entrepreneurs and startups through their core offerings of programming, coaching and mentoring, funding, events, and creative physical infrastructure. And then in Nova Scotia, Ignite is a local innovation hub where ideas become reality by engaging youth, communities, startups, and industry to find solutions for challenges being faced in the region. Ignite is dedicated to creating a local culture of innovation. And then very similarly, but over in PEI is us. So Startup Zone is a business incubator located in Charlottetown. We accelerate new startups or existing businesses by connecting them with the space, resources, and supports they need to grow. Through our resident company and accelerator programs, we connect entrepreneurs with access to skill building events, local experts in sales, marketing, and more, a workspace in the city core, and a digital network of fellow entrepreneurs. If anyone wants to know a bit more about us later on, we'll give our contact info out. But yeah, I'm really excited to bring together all the Maritimes for this. And Sebastian, I'll hand over to you if you want to introduce Jon and Rhys.
Thanks, Rachel. And just like to thank everyone for coming here today, and very excited that we got to create this very cool collab between the Maritime provinces to bring Jon and Rhys here. This is definitely going to be the place if you have a voice or an idea that you want to get out there. This will be the webinar for you to not only show you how it's done, but also show you how to structure it and build some strategy around it. So I'm going to introduce Rhys and Jon here. Rhys is my longtime friend, not new from Wales, but he hasn't lost the accent yet. He's still working on it, I hope, right? He's done tons of work for the BBC. And he's done lots of video editing, and he's moved into podcasts recently. And I just have to give a little shout out to his Canada Politics is Boring podcast, which keeps topping the charts in new ways. I think it was more popular than Joe Rogan's podcast there for a minute. It keeps bouncing around.
Only in a small Caribbean nation did we beat Joe Rogan.
Hey, but you know, you did. That's the cool part.
Antigua and Barbuda, I think it was called.
That's right.
Victors of
yeah, and his cellmate right next to him, it looks like they're in a prison. Jon similarly has tons of experience in this realm. Has done a huge amount of work for large corporations, Lego, Disney, NBA, people like that. But he's taken a new approach on the local level and the smaller level. So he's definitely working with Startup Zone, Planet Hatch, and Ignite with Rhys at Podstarter to get the word out and to help people start podcasts and find their voice. So without further ado, I will flip it over to you guys and let you run with it.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. So as you, Sebastian mentioned, I'm Jon. This is Rhys. There's a couple of things. This presentation really is a fundamental sort of podcast 101. As a company, we're solely focused on just podcasting, but there are so many elements to making good podcasts or podcasts that succeed based on whatever your objectives are, that this is really sort of, it's a crash course on the sort of 4 steps of it. So we're going to run through that. Sebastian introduced us a little bit. I don't know if you want to, brag a little more.
Did a really good intro. Hi, I'm Rhys. I'm originally from the UK. I moved to Canada 2.5 years ago. I used to work for the BBC and a bunch of other brands, and TV, radio, and got into podcasting in about 2015 with a show called The Unexplainers. And things kind of got out of control from there.
I, on the other hand, am born and raised in Alberta, I think for about 12 years, lived in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, moved back here in 2006, and then found myself on a plane almost once a week as well, working with unusual clients from coast to coast to coast. And mainly my job has always been building content and building experiences that connect with an audience. And podcasting fits really well into that space that talks about how do I take a voice and reach a particular audience. And it's different from whether it's trying to be the next Joe Rogan looking for mass audience or mass distribution, to understanding what your niche is. If you're looking to actually just talk to 12 people and build a podcast that resonates with that audience, there's ways to do that. This presentation is sort of going to run through that. As a company, we are, well, it's interesting. We're set up as we were originally, if you look up at the top right, we had a podcast portable kit. We had launched just before COVID and realized that organizations were not looking at coming into a studio, but were looking to launch podcasts during this, the pandemic, from a remote standpoint. And as an organization, we sort of built into having a Halifax studio, Bridgewater studio. We're talking about being into Pictou, Yarmouth. But the accessibility of podcasting means it doesn't need to be done in a studio. It could be something as simple as a home space, a home environment. And we've got even street level experiences that we'll talk about later as well.
And on the left-hand side, there's a few of the shows and clients that we worked on, that we're currently producing for. And yeah, we've also experimented with a space in Bridgewater. We're kind of really passionate about creating low-cost or free podcasting environments for smaller communities, just to give people access to good kit and good practice, just to help them kind of sharpen and enter the podcasting space.
Before we jump into the presentation, to give you a sense of, there's a little bit more involved in a podcast than most people think. And that's sort of where we enter. We're typically an organization that was originally from consulting or workshops or educational conversations to teach people how to do it. But if you're thinking about launching a podcast, or if you've launched a podcast, you'll know that there are about three elements, three sort of buckets that you need to be an expert in, or be able to be aware of. We talk at length about the pre-production, the planning, sort of where you put on a producer's hat to say, what is the story I'm going to tell? Who am I going to talk to? What does that sort of look like? And then building out that platform to distribute it on digitally. The second piece is the sort of the production and creative services. This is one of Rhys's expertise.
Yeah. So essentially, you're talking about the style of the show, the physical kind of recording, the questions, the length, the kind of the creative audio that you're going to use, the music, all those things. Just that period of recording and then mixing the audio to create this kind of perfect final file that you kind of imagined your podcast would be.
We talk at length about understanding first who's your audience, who you're trying to speak to, and then crafting stories that resonate with that audience. And then the third one, so we're sort of asked backwards, I guess, on this, because it is objectives and KPIs and why you're actually trying to launch it. But ultimately, good podcasts or targeted podcasts understand their audience first, understand what the story they're going to tell. And then this last bucket here is we're at a couple of seminars that were talking about podcasters not knowing how to break through and reaching their audience. And some people were saying that you've got to spend about half your time marketing and promoting the podcast, half as much as you do on the production. So this last bucket is making sure that your podcast is a success by building out things like additional content, other distribution sources, making sure you're building content for your digital and social channels. There's a whole strategy, and we'll talk a little bit about that, which is that third bucket. But we always say, if you're going to be a podcaster, make sure you've got these three hats to put on and to be able to wear. So for today, we've got four things that we want to jump into. And like I say, it is a podcast 101. There's a lot to cram in here in about an hour, and then we're hopefully we'll have some good time for some questions afterwards as well. But we're fans of saying, before you start, listen. And this is sort of market intelligence, market research. Understand what's already out there. So Rhys has got a great story that talks about knitting podcasts, where he was trying to figure out if it's a blue ocean space. There's nothing there. Maybe I can launch a knitting. I'm not sure why.
I'm not into knitting. It was just an example.
Right. Rumors. But understand that the podcasts really are niche, but understand what's already out there. So before you start, listen. We're going to jump into that.
There are about 30 knitting podcasts already. I don't know how they talk or visualize the knitting through audio, but they do exist.
The next that we're going to get into is telling good stories. How do you actually tell a story that resonates with an audience? So we'll sort of roll out the nuts and bolts of telling good stories and how stories can succeed in a podcast audio only structure. Then we're going to get into the gear and equipment. What do I actually need to launch a podcast? And it can be as simple or as complex as we want to make it from a gear and equipment standpoint. And then that last thing is that reaching an audience. How do you actually take that podcast, when you distribute it, actually grow the audience and reach your particular audience? Anything to add to that, Rhys?
No, let's get into it.
So before you start, listen, and there's a couple of reasons for this. We know that the industry is absolutely exploding. There are a lot of active podcasts in the market, over 800,000 active podcasts in the market. There's 30 million episodes in about 100 different languages. Now, some people go, well, okay, how am I going to find my space? It's already cluttered. Should I do this? That's never our message. Our message is always talking about podcasts can find their lane and can find their audiences. And we've got great examples of recent podcasts that we've launched that have done exactly that. So understanding that it may be a cluttered market, but try to figure out the blue ocean, the space that you'll fit, and then figure out how you stand apart against other podcasts that may be in that space.
And just for context as well, like 800,000 active podcasts sounds like a lot, but there are 500 million blogs and there are 31 million YouTube channels. So there's still plenty of space for podcasting. There's still plenty of opportunities. People might say everyone's got a podcast, but even more people have got blogs and YouTube channels, and they're still setting new ones up, and there are still opportunities in those spaces, even though there are so many. So
we talk at length about creating content, and just because some of these spaces may seem cluttered, you're not going to simply abandon YouTube. You're not going to abandon Facebook. You're not going to abandon podcasting. Finding the right or creating the right content to resonate with that audience is what we're talking about today. On the screen today, we threw this up here so you can actually take a look at sort of first impressions into the podcast space frequently are from a tile standpoint. And it is a busy space. We look at this and we talk about sort of, whoops, wrong slide. The categories that you're able to find your space. So defining who your audience is and where you fit is key.
And there are some real opportunities as well. So like these are just Apple's main genres. There are so many subgenres. So you could go into health, for instance, science even, and then there's much more specific like health and fitness, and you'll have mental health, you'll have fitness specific, you'll have other multiple genres on other platforms that do give a much wider range of choice. And each of these genres has its own ecosystem, has its own kind of good and bad shows, its successful shows that are kind of rising stars, and also gaps. There's gaps everywhere. There's a lot of podcasts that cover lots of topics, but and anything that there's always room to squeeze in and approach a topic from a completely new angle or create something that nobody's done before.
Most people think of the top 5, the ones that are the most common ones. Originally, people were exposed to podcasting, I think, through the true crime structure. But you've got everything from comedy, I think, is the number one space where the majority of the audience is listening. And so people say, well, if everyone's listening there, maybe I should create content that's in that comedic space. Or if it's a cluttered space, where do I find that different lane? Same thing from a news standpoint. Now, what's interesting in these top 5 genres, we notice that depending on the genre that you're in, it really starts to talk about the style and the format of the content that you're creating. If it's news, is it a 5-minute alert? So it's a 5-minute quick session. Or if it's news, is it a deep dive into individual stories that may be an hour and a half long? So understanding the genres and where you fit, you'll start to notice that if you're listening, the podcasts that you're emulating or similar to, you may figure out either how do you stand apart, or if the audience is always looking for bite-sized content, don't create long-form content, for example.
Also, interestingly, during COVID, when there was no sport on TV, sports in North America now, when there was no sports on TV, the sports genre shot through the roof because there was no live sport to watch. There was no kind of people needed their hit, and but there were lots of professional sports people sat around with plenty of time just to train and no real ability to leave their homes. So you found that the engagement in podcasting shot through the roof because there were people wanting to hear about it, and there were people there with time to talk about it too. So those genres, each genre has a real opportunity. And if you want to launch a comedy podcast and you want it to actually start to chart or perform well within a genre, don't necessarily put it in comedy. Why don't you pitch yourself as a true crime podcast, but with comedians? Sometimes you can find that just by creating one thing, but then labeling it as something else will make you different in that space.
It's interesting. We noticed that also during COVID that the podcasts that were really popular in the commute all of a sudden took a downturn as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
there's understanding that audience, right? So how does my audience, when do they consume content? What are they doing? And so when we think about the commute, when people stop traveling, going to work, that we're typically downloading a podcast and listening it on their drive to work. As soon as people stop driving to work, then your audience sort of shifted there. So for those podcasters, it was trying to figure out, how do I then now become consumed outside of that format? So a lot of this that we're talking about is it's from a marketing standpoint, it's persona driven. And as most businesses understand who they're trying to sell to, who their muse is, who their audience is, it's the same thing from a podcast standpoint. Understand the content that you want to create that's targeted towards a specific audience. We always say the first step really is understanding that person. Who are you speaking to? And it helps you then evolve into, how do I craft stories? How do I push out content? How do I actually reach into that individual? But understand, before you start a podcast, find out who you want to speak to, and do some research into that market.
A lot of podcasters will actually just imagine they're in the room with that one kind of amalgam of the audience, just talking directly to them, because it is a very personal, and we'll touch on the kind of the connection you can build with people later. But on that personal level, a lot of successful podcasters have a real clear indication in their head of who they're talking to when they are talking, or who maybe is sat in the room listening to the conversation they have. So yeah, active. I'm a big fan of researching, and if you're going to launch a podcast, I suggest that you listen to a lot of podcasts just to get a real clear idea of what your podcast should be. And sometimes, I'm not saying listen and steal all the good ideas. Maybe you want to do that, but at the same time, listen to get an idea of what you like, what suits your style, what is going to tell your story the best. Find a few podcasts. Maybe it's the same genre. Maybe you're not interested in the subject. You just like how it's delivered. And you can do things like think about the structure, think about the pace, think about the duration of the podcast, the voices, the tone, the chemistry between the hosts. Does it work for you? Are you listening and going, I'm having a really good time? Are you engaged in the actual content? And then technical things like the audio quality and how it's packaged. Have they just dumped some music on top that doesn't really fit and then just faded down without really trying to make the music work? Does it sound so bad that you can listen to it in headphones, but when you listen to it in the car on the speakers, it's too bassy and everything rattles? Do they even have an audience? You can look at their reviews and their ratings and get an idea of not only if they've got some traction from that style of show, but also how people feel about this show, how people feel about the hosts. And then one of the most important things is, have they actually posted an episode in the last 2 years? Because there are so many dead shows that look and track as live shows. A podcast, the Unexplainers, the kind of the mystery comedy show I used to make in the UK, hasn't posted an episode for nearly 2 years, I think. And it's kind of like dormant. It still gets a few hundred downloads a day, and no new content has been posted, but it still exists and looks like a living, breathing thing, even though we've just kind of paid the monthly subscription to Libsyn without doing anything with it for a while. So that somebody might swoop in and go, well, I'm going to do a show that is similar to it, that audience misses. I would like to kind of pick up the mantle and take over and fill that space. So really take time to just listen and listen with purpose and make notes and identify and shape in your mind what your podcast could be and what other people have done in the past.
I love the positioning of this that Rhys is talking about. These notes inevitably become your creative brief for the podcast that you're going to launch. All of that information helps you steer, sort of like a mood board. You'll understand the pacing that you like, that resonates for you, potentially for your audience as well. It becomes the starting ground and the foundation for telling good stories, which is what our next section is. It sort of goes into, now that I understand that audience, how do I tell something that then resonates with that particular audience? We know that in the podcast space, they're genuine stories. There's a transparency and an honesty with podcasts that allow businesses, organizations, individuals to be able to share their thoughts, opinions, act as thought leaders, and have a conversation within a community that people are choosing to listen to. The nice thing about this from a marketing standpoint, it's not an outbound strategy. You're not pushing just content. and blasting people. People are finding the content and then coming to you as an organization or as a thought leader and building the community around that. So we've noticed that from a podcast standpoint, it really builds that loyal audience, people that start to follow you, get involved with your message. And they're opting in as opposed to being pushed marketing messaging.
And it's really weird the level that people engage with your voice. It can be quite unusual sometimes. So I've had instances where people will quote something or tell me a joke that they heard on Canadian Politics is Boring. I can't remember. I don't remember what I said. And they go, remember you said this? And I'm like, no, I've got no idea. So it's really funny the effect it has with people. I've never made anything or said anything that anyone's ever done that before with, but I don't know what it is about the medium that seems to engage people. But one theory is this. So campfires, stories around campfires, how people like to learn and digest information. You know, the oral tradition, the oral storytelling tradition for humans is goes as far back as you could imagine, really, as languages existed. So, you know, storytelling has been important for teaching people moral lessons. The Aboriginal Australians have used storytelling to basically give directions. These stories would be a series of landmarks that would then give you directions to like safe passage or to find water or whatever it may be. So our brains are just programmed to really digest information through stories. You get these memory experts who are like in the Guinness World Records for being able to remember the most amount of objects on a table. And the technique they use is they tell a story in their mind with those objects, and then they just recount the story. And that's how they kind of gear their minds to remember things. So it hacks into something that is very kind of fundamental in the human brain. And it's a very powerful tool that you can use.
And we don't want to get into the marketing element that talks about things like brand recall, advertising messages, all that kind of stuff.
I don't like those words.
No, right. I'm the marketer. He's right. But it's one of the things that we've talked about is I love this quote, but I'll get you to run into the quote in a second. But when you talk about reading a book versus actually watching the movie, the book itself, your mind is able to fill in the gaps. From a visual standpoint, it's the same thing with a storytelling mechanism, where if somebody's telling the story, you envision what is happening and you're creating things within your mind that helps you sort of position yourself in that space. It's almost like you're inserting yourself into the movie. When you actually go to the movie, you're not. It's somebody else's vision. And that element within your brain creates that level of trust and understanding and recall and all that kind of wonderful stuff.
And you do get this weird phenomenon where people just, it's not necessarily one voice talking into a microphone. It might be a group of friends talking about a topic, like reviewing a film or talking about, their favorite sports or whatever. And you will find that some people, and I personally listen to podcasts for this, I just like I'm sat around the table with them, and it's like a conversation with friends might have back in the UK who I haven't seen in a long time. You just feel like you're part of this kind of group of people having an open, honest conversation, and you feel buy into it in that sense.
Do you want to do your listening through your ears quote?
Listening through my ears?
Yeah, that's the quote here, right? When listening through your ears, I always get a kick out of it.
When listening through ears. Also, I'm sure people are disappointed when they see podcasters in the flesh want to listen to their voices for too long. Which
is part of our next slide is we're both in the production space, video production as well. You just, as creatives, you're naturally in that space when people are talking about video content, and we do this from a podcast standpoint as well. I'd love to say that we are purists in the sense of knowing that podcasts, and the more successful podcasts, unless you're famous, are really rich on just the audio storytelling of it. We'll talk about additional content of how can I make, like what we're doing right now. We're podcasters, but of course you're seeing us with a live video feed as well. But most people, having the conversation is natural. The microphone in front of you is more natural. The camera in front of you is less natural, and you become a different person, or you seize up, or all sorts of different issues around. There's an expertise associated to having the camera on you. Whereas you can sit down with a subject matter expert and say, here, tell me what you know about knitting, for example. And somebody that has a passion about knitting will be able to just carry on that story. Whereas if I put a locked camera on them and say, okay, now I want to know everything about knitting, they sort of seize up and structure. So we like the authenticity of just sort of an unscripted dialogue, kind of like what we're doing right now. Rhys and I are not hiding any thoughts or opinions. We're sort of rolling it all out. It's not a
I am.
it's not a polished scripted dialogue. It is truth around podcasting from our standpoint, right?
And also, like, having directed and interviewed people on camera, the art of trying to get people to calm down, relax, feel comfortable, it takes a lot of time, but the immediacy of people forgetting about a microphone in front of them is incredible. If you kind of timed it next to each other, you just get people just open up in a way when they can't be seen and it's just their voice. There's a level of comfort that just comes much more naturally, I find. We ripped this from Buzzsprout for a couple of reasons. We kind of disagree with it, but it's also a good framework for the different types of podcast formats from storytelling. And you can see on the screen that talks about sort of the interview approach, which is probably the most common, where you've got two individuals in a room and it's sort of one person asks questions, the other person responds. It is fast and easy to produce, develop, and distribute. But we've talked about things like actual storytelling approaches to take that dialogue and to recut it and rescript it. Very similar to what you see in the bottom right of the slide, which is the documentary approach, which is I actually want to tell a story. I need to have sort of a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion as I go through. It's not just sort of an interview process. Yeah, for me, I would group this as actually just 3 different formats. So you've got the top 4: monologue, multi-host, interview, roundtable. To me, they are kind of, we are in a room. We are going to talk, essentially. There may be some scripting, a lot of it is off the cuff. And then the other 2, narrative and documentary, those 2 are really distinct from the 4 above. So narrative might involve script writers, actors, it might involve Foley, like sound design work. And then the documentary, might be on the road. You might have, someone trying to solve a true crime case and they're talking while they're on a bus ride into a town and they're walking around, and there's a very different tone creatively to those bottom 2 from the top 4. And also the top 4 is what people traditionally think of as a podcast, and then I think the bottom 2 are the ones that are really creatively exciting for me personally. Those are the ones that are really pushing what a podcast could be, and where there's a lot of growth areas and a lot of excitement for people, just trying new things and taking people on really exciting stories in that sense.
Rhys raises a real interesting point in this, which is the scripted versus unscripted. And the unscripted is the fast to market. The scripted is wonderful for professionals as well as for pieces of a podcast. So the introduction typically is a scripted process. So we're sort of a blended. We like to have that blended dialogue to say there are certain things, certain messages that need to get formed in a certain way. So script those and then go into an unscripted process. So it talks a little bit of both the free form, the free dialogue. We've always said in a podcast, in a dialogue, brilliance sort of falls out unexpected, and it's not scripted. It's just sort of a dialogue with people that know their stuff that just present something like this, the jokes that you tell that you didn't realize were a joke and become an accidental humor. Or
I was being serious. So, but I think as well, even with the interviews, like it's really important to think about how you structure the questions and unstructured podcasts where people just talk for an hour and a half. There's a lot of those, but I really get excited when you kind of have a guideline and a plan to ask questions or to bring up topics in a specific way that reveals information in the sense of storytelling, really.
So we've interviewed dozens of podcasters, and we're trying to figure out what made them successful, where they found failings, how they started and then grew and pivoted and changed, and all got pod fade and all of the challenges of being a podcaster. There's 2 things that stood out for us in regards to making a successful podcast. One is passion. You have to be enthusiastic about what you're having a conversation about. And that gets to things like your audience hears passion in your voice. Your audience will also start to know that if you're losing that passion, you start to struggle keeping it up. And from a content calendar standpoint, you lose that speed, you lose that momentum. So passion around it is number 1. Number 2 is know what you're talking about. And that's that subject matter expert. Make sure that the conversation that you're having or the person that you're talking to is an expert in that space. You can't lie, cheat, and steal in a podcast. You've got an audience that will quickly find out or call you out or opt out.
Or just to pivot on that, I hate that word. Sorry for saying pivot, everyone. Just to to counter that with a different perspective. Canadian politics is boring. I know nothing about Canadian politics, but and neither did my co-host. And the plan of that was to be honest about that and be honest about it as we learnt and kind of got more information and shared it between us. So even if you're not an expert, you can go into that topic, but you have to do it from the perspective of being completely honest and go, I am an idiot. This is one step at a time. And there might be people interested in that journey.
And that gets into sort of that tone of voice. I mean, we've got, I know how this works. I wonder how this works, which is sort of that tone in a podcast where it's always, there's a science podcast that we work with. And there needs to be that contrast between somebody that knows their stuff really well from a technical and somebody that represents the audience asking the questions and trying to struggle their way through it. And that's sort of that Canadian politics is boring analogy, which talks about we're both trying to learn and explore. One person is interested, the other person is not. And it's that dichotomy in relationship and dialogue that creates that interest from an audience, I think.
And usually then you find the storytelling falls into place because you have those opposing kind of forces within the topic. So you can talk about anything and the chemistry is just there. Everything starts to kind of work where you've got, someone who knows something, somebody who doesn't know something, who asks the questions that the audience might want. It really begins to write itself once you find that right chemistry and it clicks and you know who you're talking to, you know why you're talking to them, you know the honest place that you found to find that tone and voice to engage them with, then everything else should just start to click essentially, and you experiment and just try new things.
A lot of that is around storytelling. We're actually, in regards to getting found and making a successful podcast, the storytelling actually starts before somebody hits play on the podcast. And we've talked sort of about the brand promise and the commitment. And you saw the earlier slide that had all those tiles of podcasts. Trying to communicate what your podcast is before somebody listens is part of that user journey or that brand promise. And we talk about making sure your tile, your podcast tile, that image and what it says on it is on point. It's specific to what that podcast is. So when I look at the tile, I go, okay, I know if it's comedy, it's humor. I know if it's a business. I know if it's news. I can see that right out of the gate, and it stands apart differently from others. The second thing gets into the title. So the brand promise sort of touches on those four elements, from the tile, the image, to what's the title. And we talk a little bit about, we're not SEO experts, but the title, if it's confusing, misspelled, if it's not on the nose, it may potentially lose that audience. Same thing with the description. As soon as I start to read the description, does it resonate with me as a listener? And the last thing that we suggest is making sure that teaser episode. So actually you're recording a podcast that is just like your movie trailer. It is describing, why am I going to listen to this? What are we going to talk about? What am I going to learn? What's the outcome? What's the flavor and the tone? And that teaser episode really is your advertisement for what the podcast is. This is part of the brand promise. Now, what we want to do is we've got an example of how this has been done with a podcast that we had recently done, and
this is my ego slide.
Well, you can't talk about it. And so we had done the same exercise that we just suggested you do, which is do some market research, understand where the blue ocean space is, where nobody is. And Rhys had, in downtime, had realized that he was looking for Canadian political information. He's not native of Canada, as you've probably noticed, and was trying to find a comedy, education, and was able to use that practice of finding the blue ocean space to say, okay, now how can I launch a podcast within that space? And from a top show standpoint, was able to get third in the ranking on this slide. All of this led to what that brand promise was, right? So
yeah,
what should you call it? What should the tile look like?
I think that's it. A lot of the time people don't get the title right. So the thought process behind Canadian politics is boring was that we're going to do a comedy show about Canadian politics. Everyone thinks Canadian politics is boring. So we will own that from that first step. We will address that first thing that comes into people's heads. And that was the only reason for the podcast, was just thinking what people might feel when they see the title. So take a lot of time to think about your title. Try and be clever with it. If there's a phrase or common terms from your niche or your business that get used, sometimes people work those in quite well. You can do wordplay. You can swap words out in a common phrase quite successfully sometimes. It can be good to not use the word podcast in the title because most people are finding your podcast through podcast platforms. Once you get off a podcast platform, say podcasts, because if you're on Facebook, you need people to know that it is a podcast, but you don't need to waste space or necessarily use that word as commonly as it's sometimes used on a lot of shows. And one of the key things that a lot of people don't do is check that nobody else has that name or a similar name. Because if you just meet someone and recommend this podcast, or they just maybe have seen something you've posted on social media and go, I'm going to search that in my podcast app. Sometimes I've done that and you've had like 15 podcasts with very similar names or the same name, and they're way down the bottom. Just do your due diligence. I've heard of some people getting threatening legal letters off established shows because they have the same name. It doesn't always get to that extreme, but just at the very least, it just reduces your ability to be discovered just because you share that search term with so many other people. So whenever we launch a podcast, we always make sure that if you type that name, that's the thing that comes up first.
That reminds me of a story. So we're in Halifax here, and I know that Mayor Mike Savage had launched a podcast. But
Yes.
I can't remember.
It's called On Mic.
On Mic.
And there is about 20 shows called On Mic.
So trying to find and weave through that clutter is a bit of a challenge, but that's that first step. Make sure that On Mic is available, and make sure it's not MIC. Is it MIKE? Is it making sure that it's on point? Inevitably you'll find it, but make it easy for your audience.
20 people with podcasts called Mike. So the other thing is the tile and the artwork. And first of all, just on a technical level, there are guidelines on things like Apple and the other sites about minimum sizes, and sometimes they take the tile and they reformat it as a background on an app on a phone. So just make sure that it fits all the guidelines. Hire a designer if you can. If you have a budget, they will be able to work to a spec, and also getting a professional designer is sometimes worth the investment for this tile. Maybe you can get the assets and create your own additional graphics from that, but just to get that kind of clear vision from the start can make a big difference. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, just have your kind of subject matter amplified in the style of how it's put together. If it's related to an industry, you can work in common imagery that people will instantly connect with. If there's a podcast about walking dogs, makes sense to have a dog on there at least, just to get people's attention, or some familiar dog paraphernalia. And then also fonts. Sometimes people use really hard to read fonts. Sometimes there's big text. Sometimes there's text that's too small. I think that you want it to be clear and readable as much as possible, and that's why a good designer would really help out. And also, you don't need too much text. Don't forget you have a title, but then and your artwork, and then you have a description. People can find all that extra detail out. I think the key thing with the tile is a hook, that it just gets people's attention, and as we're touching on, the story starts there. They're intrigued by that. There's an emotional response to it, and then everything else can follow afterwards with the description, the teaser, the first episode, the second episode, following on it on social media. There's a real follow through that you kind of your tile is the beginning of, the pinnacle of, really.
Yeah, I was going to say you got very little real estate with your podcast tile, and Rhys is right when he talks about people are already in the platform, so putting things like a microphone doesn't make sense. So maximize that space, and if you're thinking from a brand exercise, there are, and we'll get into this, there's a whole bunch of other spots to be able to reiterate what that brand or what that message is outside of that podcast tile. So don't try to cram it in here. This is really just is that first hook, that first impression before somebody engages, and then the repeatability of it, so the recognizability of it, making sure that it stands out. So,
and if you're famous, put your face on there.
So we've jumped. So that's the first two two parts of a successful podcast. One is making sure that you understand your audience, what's in the market, make sure you're listening, do your due diligence before you start. Number two is starting to understand and craft your story. Make sure you know what your message is. How are you going to communicate it? What's the tone of voice? All of those elements. The third piece, and this is a huge moving target. You guys can search on Google, and you'll get just tons of content on what the right gear and equipment is. We've got really best practices and recommendations for it, but we're going to walk through, from a gear and equipment standpoint, the basics of what you need in order to launch a podcast.
And obviously you can see this. Some people have really gone to town. They've invested in equipment. You can buy these mixers where you can have a bunch of people around the table. We've got a Zoom L8 mixer where we can have up to 8 people. People can dial in. People can come in on Zoom. You know, we've this podcast studio that we're in now, we've filled with people. And then even like, you know, just being, I think there's a lot of terror. You see some people with these incredible podcast studios. They've, and I'm one of those people. You geek out. You spend all your free money on lights and, you know, soundproofing and, you know, the latest microphone, the best headphones, and that can be intimidating, especially if you just want to try this out and you just want to experiment and you don't want to spend like hundreds or thousands of dollars to get started. So in the microphone with the white background in the middle, the bottom image is a Blue Yeti, which you will see as kind of almost like it's kind of an entry level podcasting microphone. Is about $150. There's the Snowball is the cheaper one, again, is like $50 to $70, I think. Those are USB microphones that I think are great quality for the money. And are a really good starting point. So you can spend as much or as little as you want. The one thing I would like to stress is that you can have a $2,000 microphone, but if it's in the wrong environment, it will sound terrible. You can have a $50 microphone. If it is in the right environment, it can sound brilliant. So the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the pillow fort around the laptop. That is another really common thing. Really established podcasters, they've never built a studio. They don't have the space. They build pillow forts because that sounds great. And you could be talking into your phone or just the internal speaker on your laptop, and you can make it sound good just by creating the right environment. And you can do that with things around you. So the top right-hand corner, that office space with the microphones on the table, will sound terrible. You've got lots of hard surfaces. You've got a big glass window. You've got hard, walls. It's just very echoey. But you go to the top left-hand corner, you've got curtains. You've got thicker carpet. If you can find ways of deadening the sound in there, that those kind of environments can sound a lot better in that sense. If you just use things around you or put a little thought into creating the environment, you don't need to spend a lot of money.
I think there's really only 3 takeaways from this slide and from this conversation. One is microphones. They're not all equal, but you can have a really expensive microphone used in a bad environment, used in a bad way, and it loses that value. So understanding the gear and equipment, again, we're impartial to that. The second thing was how you're actually using it. And that's the position and orientation of your body, of your mouth, and the space around it. So the further you're getting away, the less you're actually, there's a best way to be, I think it's a hand fist or a fist away from the actual microphone. So it's that position and making sure that you're not tapping and making noises and moving around that space. The third one, and this is, we counsel people at home that talk about, please don't do a podcast in your kitchen. It's tiled surfaces, hard cabinets. There's nothing that really dampens that sound.
You've got a fridge as well, away in the background.
So understanding your environment, and bedrooms are much better, right? So same thing from an office standpoint, less glass windows, less hard surfaces. So those are the 3 fundamentals of being able to record a good podcast from a sound quality standpoint.
A lot of our clients during COVID ended up spending a lot of time in closets because it was the quietest spot in their house. This is where I really geek out. I love location audio. I love going and recording and making audio content out in the wild or in people's where people are really. There's something really exciting about that. And these are just a selection of location recording units. Now, some of them you can actually use as studio mixers as well. So some of the Zoom units you can plug like 4 microphones into, and then you can unplug them and use them then out in the wilds as well. And some of some of those are like $100, some are $150. They kind of just like glorified dictaphones, you do want some of the windproof kind of treatment, which is the furry dead cats that you put over the top of the microphones. They're not really made out of cats; it's just like an industry nickname for them. But you can kind of I like those because I keep one in my bag, and sometimes you just go, oh, that sounds cool, and you might just record some sound, put it in the database. You might use that.
One of the things that we've talked about, a lot of people use a microphone into their laptop, and the laptop using something like QuickTime allows you to be able to store and record files. A lot of what you see on the screen here is a single purpose device that is intended just to record audio. So that's one of the things that we talk about from the right gear. The other thing that I like about this slide, and we didn't talk about this in the creative element, is if you do that dog podcast, actually be out in the field and getting those sounds and effects of the dog at the dog park, and all of a sudden you can enrich that storytelling message. We're doing one for knitting. So if you're doing knitting, same thing with the knitting needles.
We're not doing one for knitting.
No, I checked myself and went back to the knitting to keep your theme going. But understand it. So the location audio is when you're telling rich stories, if you're describing scenarios and you're able to add in effects or elements and allow and make it a journey for your listener, so that it's not just listening to two people in a room, but it's actually involving the dog or involving the knitting or whatever your subject matter is going to be.
Hey, editing. If you
Everybody sit down, this could take us a while.
Either you love editing or you hate editing. I've really met someone who's on the fence about whether they like editing. So some people don't edit their podcasts. They just hit record, they put it out, they let all the mistakes, they leave them in, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I know some people want to capture a story authentically, and they feel that editing it will take away from that person's story being told in their own way. And there's a perfectly legitimate way of approaching your podcast. But if you want to take out ums and ahs and pauses, or you want to take out whole sections where you went off on a tangent talking about your new fence or your new car or something, and you're like, this isn't relevant to the history of PEI, I'm going to take this out. You have those things that happen because it's a free-flowing conversation. So things like the top left-hand corner, the headphones with a little fuzzy line in between, that is Audacity, which is a free open source audio editing platform, and it's great for free, and it's got a great community around it because it is open source. There's lots of people who use it, lots of people who are willing to help new users, lots of forums and guides and things. So if you want to geek out and have an entry level package, that's good. A lot of people use GarageBand, the middle one at the top. That's free with most Apple computers. I think it's free with all Apple computers, but that is a really user-friendly way of mixing a podcast for the first time, or a good introductory way to get into audio editing. Audacity is a bit more technical looking and a bit more intimidating looking if you're not used to it. Logic is the top right-hand corner, which is a slightly more advanced package. Adobe Audition in the bottom left-hand corner is kind of a pro level. It can be intimidating to look at, but it's actually quite simple to use once you get into it. The pro element is that there's so many choices of filters and effects and ways to treat the audio. Like if somebody slams a door in the background, you can paint the door slam out. It's incredibly powerful. It's like a subscription-based package, so you have to pay monthly to use it. But often then it gives you can either subscribe to just that package, or you can pay for this multi-package where you get Photoshop and Premiere and After Effects and all the other creative suite that Adobe offers, which might be useful for creating other content. And then Soundtrap is owned by Spotify, and it's quite unique. It's on here because it's browser based, and it allows you to edit the audio by moving the text around. So it transcribes the audio, and then you can copy and paste the text. So it's almost like editing a Word doc rather than editing audio in that sense. So that is also a good way of introducing yourself to audio editing, and quite a cool innovation, I think. If you have an accent like me, if you've got an exotic accent, then it doesn't always understand you. So if you have a clean-cut North American accent, then you'll be fine.
GarageBand,
yeah. GarageBand.
So in regards to distribution, so that's a good sense on gear that you want to get to distribute, gear you want to record, and then gear you want to edit with, or software and technology. Two other pieces to this is your distribution platforms and your hosting platforms. You're creating an RSS feed, creating an audio file. and the distribution of that is typically free to be able to create that. Then there are sort of back-end hosting tools that allow you to hit all the platforms. So as an end user, I can listen to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Anchor, etc. And so understanding these back-end hosting services, and there are a lot. And the differentiation on some of them are capacity on hosting, on distribution, on analytics, on ease of use. Again, we're impartial to all of these. We've used a variety of them for different reasons, but essentially these are your hosting mechanisms to be able to get your podcast out.
We're impartial, but I love Libsyn. So.
One of the things that has come up in during COVID as well is remote recording. And we'd not ever had this slide in here before, but it seems to be relevant now, where people are now recording Zoom conversations like we're doing right now, and using this as the starting point for building out a podcast in a variety of different ways. And there are a bunch of different tools, also impartial to all of them, which he's going to tell you who he's partial to. But so Squadcast is a video platform originally designed just as a podcast platform with a video element. Zencaster, same thing. Zencaster was just audio only. And some of these, the differentiations between them are the ability to record online, to save a file down to your machine, and being able to have backups from a recording standpoint. Some of these platforms are focused on audio quality. So for example, Zoom is not really designed as voice quality. It's more of a meeting space that makes sure that we can have multiple people in the space and a video element. So our preference typically, of course, wouldn't be Zoom for creating podcast content.
And what you find is that like Zencaster and Squadcast, they record local versions, both sides, and they use the browser. Like, they tend to work on Google Chrome primarily, I think. But the only issue is that if the person you're remotely connecting with has problems with their machine, it can be problematic. And on some occasions, we'll be recording Zencaster and Squadcast. We've done both. I tend to prefer Zencaster just because there is no video element. It is just pure audio. And if you have the pro version, there's some extra features that I really like. But the one thing I would say, sorry, I might be not being impartial.
No, I was going to ask you if you actually are starting to get paid by all these plugs that you typically do.
Wow. No, so, but to go back,
sorry.
I would say whichever platform you are using, go to the free audio record software on your Mac, which is the QuickTime symbol on the bottom left, or voice recorder on Windows on the bottom right hand side, and select the input, the USB mic, however you're recording, and just hit record on your own local laptop. Coach the other person to do it at the other side, just so even if those platforms fail after 90 minutes of getting this important interview, you have backups either side and they can just share it with Dropbox or G Drive or whatever afterwards. It's always good to have that's almost like a triple backup then, in that sense. I would suggest doing that, because it can be embarrassing and disheartening and frustrating to have to redo an entire episode again. So make sure that you use that. You could even just use Zoom or do a conference like this and still record both sides and get really good quality audio. And the local recordings won't have lag or disruption from the online connection.
So all of that said, so there's a lot there, but we wanted to simplify this. In the last slide in regards to the gear and equipment section, is this example.
Yeah, so this is Theo Henderson, the gentleman on the right holding the phone. So we've talked about kit and platforms and editing. He's homeless and he lives in LA, and he uses Anchor, which is a Spotify-owned app that is really good because it launches you on lots of platforms immediately, but there are lots of downsides to using Anchor as well. I'll happily go into if anyone's thinking of launching and using it, but he's homeless and he makes a podcast on his phone and it's distributed from that. So you don't necessarily need to even have all these things. He's creating really amazing storytelling, kind of a story-led content with people, and just using his smartphone, and it gives him access and flexibility to do it around his lifestyle, his situation that he's currently in. So don't be disheartened if all of that has thrown you off, because you can still just tell good stories even without all that equipment and investment.
Lastly, is trying to reach your audience. And this is, as I mentioned earlier on, part of the challenge of creating a good podcast, building a better mousetrap, is trying to getting it found. And we've got a lot of tools and tricks and conversation around this. What's really nice about the podcast is that when you're creating it, you'll see on the screen here, there's moments where you're creating additional content to be able to share with your community or share with your social media, share on your digital platforms, to be able to drive to the podcast and to other spaces that you're interested in, whether you're trying to grow a social channel, a website view, an acquisition, etc. And so we've got a slide on the screen that there's a lot of detail on this. We'll share this deck as well with you afterwards, so you can sort of go through this. But out of this, we sort of talk into things like, my first step is to transcribe the podcast. We use a tool called Temi that allows us to do transcription services, very inexpensive to do, but it allows us to have a sense of what the conversation was, review it, read it, and create things like a blog post, or use it for SEO if I want to put it onto my website to be able to say this is the conversation. I've seen it in LinkedIn as well. So LinkedIn will actually do a link into just the text version, or it actually helps you do things like closed captioning as well, or transcriptions on the podcast.
It's AI based, so it's about 90% accurate, unless you're me, where it's probably like 70 again because of the exotic accent. So.
We talked about this a little bit earlier from a description of the podcast, of the whole podcast. I like to talk about this from a creative standpoint too. The show notes is usually a description of what the podcast is, who you're talking to, what it's about, any historical information that you want to share, any other links to the guests, etc. But I like to usually write my show notes before we actually edit what the show is, because it gives you a sense of what you're hoping to get out of that episode. Share it with the person you're having a conversation with, share it with everybody to be able to say, I think this is the story that's going to come out of this conversation. So we use the show notes for two purposes. One, as a mechanism to help us write good stories or create good episodes. And two is for somebody to actually click onto your podcast and see what the show notes are. It will sort of pull people in to go, that's an episode that I'm curious and interested in.
Also, it will drive traffic to your website, so you can always refer to the additional show notes that people may want to kind of have a deeper dive on a topic. Pull quotes.
I'm not sure where you came up with the term pull quotes.
You pulled the quote out of the podcast, put it into a graphic, throw it online, everyone wins. So essentially, this is a great way of just getting some great quotes. You imagine like a conversation for 30 minutes. There's usually some really good quotes from an expert or a guest that you might have. And I think that, we're used to seeing these kind of quote formats on Instagram and other platforms as well. So it really generates a lot of opportunities to create a graphic quite cheaply with Pixar or Canva, and then share links to the podcast and create more kind of more of a drive to the show.
We're huge fans of additional content that's used from the podcast, and I love this as a not a thought leader, but as a tag and a teaser from a quote standpoint. Somebody said this particular line on the podcast, and it inspires somebody to go, I'm interested in just that sentence. And so not everyone is you're meeting your audience where your audience is. And sometimes it will just be in a LinkedIn feed that I'm scrolling through and I'm not going to listen to a podcast, or if the video is not an automatic play, I'm not going to consume it. But from a visual, it can be really rich and telling from just that one line. And this is all about whatever your objective is for doing a podcast. Is it to drive to the podcast, or is it to drive somewhere else? You can use a one-liner or one sentence. Those moments of brilliance that I've mentioned, or moments of humor that are accidental, that you're able to use in your content calendar and your strategy. The tools that Rhys mentions down at the bottom, there are a handful of tools that make this process very quick and very easy.
Audiograms. So you can basically create, we can play this. It's very short.
For love stories, ours is the best love story ever. And it's a unique one because it involves such a large group of people who probably never intended to seek out an extended family. And lo and behold, it was love at first sight.
So that was an audiogram we created for one of our clients for Charm. The Canadian Lover Map is just love stories. And that was used, we created that using Headliner, which is a great app that allows you to search any podcast, choose an episode, choose a section, and create with graphics and with an internal kind of transcription package these kind of assets. And obviously you can create a lot of these from an episode. You can also use After Effects and other kind of animation tools to create your own bespoke ones that are maybe not so based on not based on the templates of Headliner, but that that's more costly and more time consuming to do. But you can often if you're experienced with it, you can create something quite unique with that.
We are I guess we're not audio people, but we're also, well, there's a couple of comments I can go with that. What I'm trying to say is that we understand video rules the world to a degree, certain platforms. So if you have an audience on YouTube or want to inspire that audience, how do you use your podcast to build out that space? Or you're seeing what's being happened with LinkedIn, where the video feeds now become a little more a higher likelihood to click and follow through. Spotify has now announced that they are going to do video elements for their podcast. So there's a shift in the podcast space to say, how do I actually create video elements from the podcast? And it is either from tools like we just described, or having the locked camera or a camera in that particular space. There's ways to be able to meet your audience where it is, leveraging the podcast and creating these audiograms, which is a video element for these other platforms, is a great way to extend your reach and reach your audience wherever they are.
Well, this slide is about kind of if you've identified your niche, then there are some really obvious places to start going and finding communities that are going to be interested. So if you're reviewing the 90s greatest cartoons, then go to the nostalgic 90s and share your episodes, because you'll know that audience is instantly going to gel with the content you're creating. So it sounds simple, but sometimes it takes a bit of perseverance to get in and befriend those communities and share the content. And those audiograms can work really well to, rather than just a post saying, hey, I've launched a podcast, just that audiogram, if it grabs people, can be a real way to lead people in.
Your guests on your shows are a huge resource as well. And you're tapping into a community here. Community driven, it allows people to sort of build around that space, and your guests have their own followers, and they're proud to be on the podcast. They want to share that as well. So making sure that you're tagging your guests that are on the shows when they get released, and pulling them back into that conversation, and asking them to do the same thing from a promotional standpoint and from a reference standpoint, allows you to build on not only your community and your group, but also taps into their space and their influence as well. So tagging guests gives you that extended reach.
Also asking your guests to share your podcast as well. So obviously it's coming from them, it's to their audience. That can have a huge impact too, especially same with tagging guests. If you manage to get an influencer with a big audience to do this, to share and talk about it, that can have a huge impact on your download figures and interest in the podcast. Traditional media. Sorry for the headline on this. You can find creative ways to get in the news. So if you're covering a story or doing interesting things, talking about current topics, you can sometimes take your podcast to a journalist or some local press and get some free coverage. So if you're the first person to be doing a podcast in a community, there might be local press. This Daily Mail headline was actually a hoax that we did for the Unexplainers, where we took photos of mayflies that kind of look a bit like fairies if you squint. And it blew up. We had like 19,000 shares. The comments were hilarious. Nobody believed it, but the paper ran it anyway, but it drove a lot of traffic to the show. It was just a good, fun opportunity to kind of get in the press and get some exposure.
We've talked about thought leadership or thought pieces, content that you're creating from the conversation that you're having. So if you've got a guest on that is an expert at dogs or an expert at knitting, being able to create the dialogue from that, so you can create your blog post, your vlogs, your listicles, anything that you want to be able to repurpose coming from that really helps you. As we said, it's transparent, it's honest. It helps you position yourself as an expert in that conversation. And often it will bleed into traditional media, as Rhys was just mentioning, but it'll also allow you to participate in communities on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, for example.
So if you see that there's a news topic that comes up based on something you've talked about in a past episode or that you've kind of covered before, you can then really, use that as an excuse to talk about and share and add value to what the conversation is about. You might be able to add depth with that news story by sharing your podcast and that interview you may have had with an expert or with someone involved in that news story maybe. So be aware of current trends and how your back catalogue of episodes could be leveraged against what is trending on that day.
There's another element to the news topics as well. A lot of times people get into a groove on a schedule, right? So I'm releasing a weekly podcast every Thursday and off it goes. We're fans of timely releases as well. So not only in that regularity of a release, but doing your bonus episode that if something dramatic happened in your space, in your industry, launch a bonus episode that speaks about what's currently going on. We've noticed that the first few podcasts that we launched in the early days of COVID, for example, people were searching and looking for that content, and having podcast content then got picked up and consumed either from news, public, and corporate organizations as well, looking for relevant news delivered in an honest and authentic way.
And then this is kind of just the standard, hey, it's been a year since we did. You get those reminders on your phone saying, hey, this is what you were doing last year. Maybe there's Our Fake History is a great show. Sebastian Major, the host, shares things on historical anniversaries that are relevant. There's lots of opportunities to kind of bring out old content, old moments, old topics. Again, if they're trending or in the news at that time. And then the other one is associated mentions. So this was a Beef and Dairy podcast, got a big star on. We'd interviewed Ben on some of our shows, and podcasting is a community. So often if you've got close links with the podcast, you've been a guest on their show, they've been a guest on. There's just, it's great to celebrate successes or amazing moments they've had, just to kind of build that community further. And then they'll likely repay the favor with other news stories and things as well.
We had once done a presentation that talked about why you shouldn't do a podcast. And we closed off on this particular slide. There is, from a guest standpoint, one of the first things you should do if you're not on a podcast, if you don't have a podcast, is be on a podcast. It is one of the best ways to educate yourself, understand, and see how what's involved in the podcast. So we like it from a process standpoint, be a guest, but it also helps you grow your podcast by being a guest in that space. Again, back to finding those areas of influence and expanding those communities and networks. By being a guest, it helps you be in those conversations, being in those communities. So if you take anything away from this, I think we've always said, find those opportunities to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. Everybody that's on this call should be an expert in something, an expert in what you're doing at work, whether it's a personal, whether all sorts of, everyone has an expertise. Find that podcast that you could be a guest on and start.
Also, don't forget that being a guest on other shows, if you look at that chart, the bottom left-hand corner, there is a spike you can see about July the 27th. And that was the download figures for the Unexplainers. That spike was the day after a release where I did a guest slot on Astonishing Legends. Now, they're a big show. They've had like 80 million downloads. I think they're probably getting, by now it's probably closer to 100 million downloads, but just that guest slot on an associated topic on their show just turbocharged. You can see what it did for the following month, pretty much. So, one of the best things you can do is find the right shows that have a similar kind of topic or similar kind of tone that will get value from you cross-promoting. And if you're on somebody's show, it's almost expected that you're going to plug your own podcast as well. So it can work really well in that sense. Don't be afraid to reach out to other people if they're a similar kind of show to yours. That's not a negative thing. They're not necessarily competition. They might be an advocate. They might be someone who is willing to give you some extra exposure.
And lastly, so everything that's sort of feeding up to here is what's involved in launching a podcast. We talk at length about the content calendar, which is everything from how often are you scheduling it, how are you releasing it, how are you promoting around the edges and the sides of it. And a podcast platform is more than just, am I on Spotify, am I on iTunes? It is understanding and meeting that audience wherever they are, and whether it's a Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, etc. understanding you can build content from the podcast that fits into that content calendar on those digital and social platforms as well. So it's there's a great extension beyond that, but understanding how does a podcast fit into that calendar? How does it fit into your workflow? How does it fit into everything else? Hopefully part of this conversation was to say what's involved with it. It's as simple as a cell phone and anchor to be able to get out to market potentially. And tricks and tools on ways to be able to make sure that it works from a know your audience, understand your story, and go from there.
Like if you want to launch a successful podcast, there is a lot of work involved. But yeah, how often you release the show as well is gonna. If you commit to a weekly show, then you don't want to let your audience down when you build the momentum. So if you think I can't achieve all this, then maybe you do every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, once a month. It's worth kind of building all of this strategy and information into what's realistic for your time.
So that is our podcast 101. I know there's a lot to chew on that. We'll share this deck as well so you can sort of go through it. But I think fundamentally, those are the 4 brackets that you want to be able to look into. And everybody's really good at some of them, maybe all of them as well. But we're convinced podcasting is accessible, approachable, and easy for anybody to be able to do. Lots of resources online. Our information's on the screen as well, so you can use us as a resource as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Taking notes the whole time. I'm really excited about all this. So we have a few questions in the chat. So we'll start with those. And then if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to send them in now. Or if you want to ask them to Jon and Rhys yourself, just let me know. But the first one we have in the chat is from Suzanne, and she's looking for tips for differentiating your podcast. She's looking to start a podcast for truckers, but there are already so many out there.
Well, I guess I've not really looked into the trucker market. I'm not a trucker personally, but I think that again, listen to what's out there. Listen to the kind of shows that they are listening to, and think from there what you can offer that's different. Maybe even speak to some truckers. Do some market research. Look at the reviews of what are some of the most popular podcasts getting negative reviews because there's something they're really missing doing in this show, and you go, well, I could do that they're not covering. It doesn't hurt. I would say do some research into it. You've got a clear niche there that you really want to dive into. So that's a real asset to know that you've got your audience there. You know who they are, so that you can speak to them. Maybe go on some trucker forums and go, what podcasts do you like, or maybe put a questionnaire together on Google form or a Google Doc. Just asking as many questions as possible and use that to really get an idea of a gap in the market or a new way to approach the kind of topics you want to discuss.
Awesome. A few more in the chat here. So the next one is another really good one. How many episodes should you consider having ready before launching?
As many as possible, as many as you can.
It depends on how long it takes you to actually produce them. And we like to have a lot in the can before you go to market. And we've gotten burned ourselves where we're on a weekly schedule with a podcast and we are only 1 episode ahead, and it creates a bit of terror as you're trying to get to market. So, you don't want to be over consumed by doing podcasts. I love to roll out, if you're on a weekly basis, roll out a full month. Make sure you've got 4 in the can to be able to sit back and say, okay, off I go. Things come up. Audience members cancel or guests cancel. Holidays squeak in. You get busy with something else. So making sure you've got, we've actually done full seasons where you'll actually have 12 episodes and then you do a drip release once a month.
It allows you to really focus on the marketing as well. You're not stressed out and chasing your tail. You can go, how can I promote this? How can that hour I was going to spend chasing a new guest, I can now spend, promoting this on those forums and making those connections is really important to look at it from what a TV station would do, or Netflix or whoever. They would have all the assets ready before they release a show, and would very rarely allow it to be released until everything was ready, because then they can get all the marketing material, cut all the trailers, leak out screen grabs or whatever. It makes sense to have it there, but also it allows you time to refine it and listen back and say, this is what my first season sounds like. And you might want to tweak something in the first 2 episodes that are a revelation to you when you're doing your 8th episode. So it can be a more complete piece of creative work, rather than oh my god, I need to put an episode out next week. Forget the music. I'll interview you. You'll do. You know, you don't want to be stuck in that situation. You want it to be good quality, and buying yourself more time. You set your own deadlines, but just make sure you stick to them when you do, I guess.
One of the best pieces of advice we can give you as well is record multiple ones back to back. So take that afternoon or evening and see if you can actually get 3 or 4 recorded at the exact same time. And that pipeline allows you to say, okay, now I can edit at a later date, or you can roll it out at a later date, but try to do batch records and batch sessions and episodes. It frees up time and resources and allows you to sort of schedule it back into your regular routine.
Cool, awesome. The next one we have here are, what are some suggestions that you folks might have on simple things you can do to make an office space more podcast friendly?
I would say, firstly, look at the hard surfaces around you. So if you have laminate flooring or tiles, anything that is kind of a hard, flat surface, audio will bounce off and create echo. You call it it'll sound live, as in like there's a lot of reverberation in the room. So get a rug, get a carpet, try and hang some like drapes or whatever you can on the walls. Even create a small room if you can kind of build like a pillow fort and sit in there. If it's hanging rugs on the wall, anything like that can really help. You can build and buy your own sound panels. There's you don't need to spend thousands of dollars on really expensive sound reduction panels. You can actually build them, for less than $100 with stuff from a DIY store. You just try and soften the space. Try and put soft furnishings, anything like that. Put a blanket over the table that you're on. Even with things lying around your home, you're able to really improve the sound without having to invest any money. But if they want any further advice, I can send some links and some suggestions. There's some incredible tutorials of people just using normal sound and heat insulation from like you can buy for your basement, really successfully creating these panels that absorb sound really effectively.
That's awesome, sweet. Yeah, I think some links might be helpful if you want to send them my way, and I can send them out to folks after. So the next one we have from someone, they are 15 episodes into a sales podcast. They're thinking of pivoting the format with their target audience staying the same. What's the best approach for that?
It's interesting. We interviewed somebody that did the exact same thing. They had a podcast and they received a negative criticism that was talking about the host or the co-host, and they restructured the whole thing, still understanding that the end audience was the same, but the material needed to shift or a different audience needed to come in, and they changed the tone. They changed the whole flavor. It can be we typically, you can wrap it up as an episode or a season, and then you move into the next season. So first 15, we're focused on this, and now the next 15, and you can change the format, and you can release another teaser or an intro to say, we're changing things up, and write it in the notes and be honest and share what you're doing, and as well as why you're doing it as well. And we've talked at length about know that audience, and if it's the wrong audience that you're targeting, be comfortable to make that change. So if you lose the audience that you didn't want in order to be able to talk to the audience that you want, that's a good transition. But be clear on that as you're communicating to people. I'm a fan of packaging up a season and saying that's done, and now I'm doing another season. There was a podcaster that we were working with that has done 3 iterations from a sales podcast. And making those changes doesn't necessarily alienate an audience. It is an opportunity for improvement for you, but communicate it, be clear with it.
You can always like hold their hand, take them step by step. You can engage them in part of that process as well. You got to ask them what they think, and you could just do one episode in that new style, and or you can do the same style and then start to release this new additional episode. Maybe if it's a weekly show, you do one on the Monday, one on the Friday, and slowly phase the other one out, and ease them into it. I think as long as you communicate with an audience, as Jonathan was saying, and make them feel comfortable and let them know you care and that their listening experience is important to you, they often will be quite flexible and quite open to it. I guess as long as the motivation for the change feels like it's improving the quality, or that it's giving them more of what they want, or condensing it in a much more efficient way, or expanding it in a way that has a deeper dive. If you share that with them, you might lose a few people. Like some podcasters say they're terrified of losing their audience when they introduce commercials into their episodes. And people say, oh, we sort of drop of like 3 to 5%, but eventually they came back because, they realized it wasn't a big deal. It was just the odd commercial for Harry's Razors every once in a while, or ZipRecruiter, or all the others. So, so people, they are resilient to changes as long as you kind of, it sounds like you've already got the right attitude where you're kind of cautious that you don't want to alienate anyone. As long as you kind of let the listeners know that, then you should be okay.
Awesome. Kind of going on that sponsorship note as well. The next question says, what type of listenership numbers are podcast sponsors looking for? And then I guess just to kind of add on this, and I know it's a loaded question, but how do you obtain sponsors?
What, tens of thousands a month to at least make even a few $100s. It's not a monetization is kind of like, it's a bit of a folly in some senses. We tend to advocate podcasting for PR, communications, and marketing. If someone says, help me make lots of money from podcasting, then it's usually a difficult conversation. Sit down. I've got some truth bombs to drop.
So Rhys is right. The networks are typically looking for three things. One is the audience that you have, pure numbers, and they'll typically value it at a cost per thousand, a CPM rate. And you can work your numbers backwards. So frequently it was a $25 CPM rate is how you would value it. And Rhys is right. You have to get up to about 10,000 before networks are going to say, okay, there's an audience that I can follow. The other one is your trending. If you're growing faster and faster and getting news and noteworthy and getting recognized as having that momentum, networks are also interested in helping you then amplify that to also grow the audience. The third thing is having a niche podcast, having a gap within their portfolio. So if they're a studio that goes, we've got no knitting podcasts, and we recognize that's an audience. If you fill that gap from an audience standpoint, it allows them and their sales team to be able to sell your media and sell your audience. But Rhys makes a great point. It's the same conversation around how do you launch the next YouTube star? Are you able to build an audience and ramp it up and then monetize it? It is a difficult and not clear channel on how to grow that audience en masse. Our conversation frequently is podcasting is not intended for broadcast. It's not a broad net, and it's not great for mass audience. There are exceptions, and there are great ones that do it. Our conversation usually is around that narrow cast. Focus in on specific audiences, target that audience, and build that relationship and community. And it's not monetized based on volume.
Yeah, it's much more of and also a lot of established podcasters, they have a really diverse way of monetizing. They don't necessarily just sell ads, and that fluctuates because sometimes there's no buyer. Sometimes it's the downloads are down that month because for reasons beyond their control, like COVID, there's no one commuting, so people aren't listening as much. They find it an unreliable source of income. So things like merchandise, live shows, just kind of even corporate events, doing a podcast at a corporate event, is a more viable income for a lot of podcasters than directly selling those adverts. What's this site? Patreon. Patreon's another big one. A lot of people earn a lot of money through Patreon just by having people directly sponsor their show and then unlock additional, hidden podcasts that those who don't pay can't listen to. So a lot of people will build success with a podcast, launch a Patreon, launch a second podcast that's behind this paywall, and the hardcore audience will the kind of power listeners will follow through with it. So you have to be quite creative and quite diverse in how you try and monetize the podcast. And I wouldn't say that ads on a show, unless you're really good at building direct relationships with a brand, with a small audience that is really relevant to them. That does happen sometimes. If a very niche industry podcast, say it was Knitting, and the world's largest wool manufacturer came in and said, you're speaking to our audience, we'll fund your episodes as long as they're branded around us. Those things do happen. But it's not, I think you've got to be very creative and really kind of think about those smaller opportunities and building from there, really.
Yeah, like if you think about the trucking podcast,
yeah.
If all of a sudden you are, if all truckers listen to this podcast, you're getting a wonderful endorsement. And I would assume somebody like Peterbilt or Volvo would then want to be behind that podcast that's having a conversation with their audience. So there are so many different journeys to monetization. Pure audience acquisition, I think, is one of the hardest ones. Getting creative around, we've got a team member, actually. She does live events, and she does merchandise, and she does all of that to sort of subsidize the structure and the payment for podcasts. So there is no one clear answer on how to get monetized, and the industry is known for trying to say, it's like building an app as well. There are people that do it and make money, and there are people that don't. So if it's just to make money, it's a challenge. Making sure you've got a passion and expertise, that's crucial. And then maybe you're going to get a path to monetization.
Even if you do beat Joe Rogan in Antigua and Barbuda, you just still don't make a lot of money. So.
Well, that's really helpful, not just around sponsorship, but around monetization as a whole. So hopefully that cleared some things up for folks. We have 2 more questions to get through before 11:30. If there are any more, send them in. The next one is, do you guys have any tips on lighting when video is used?
I guess I would say that it's worth investing in some of those. If you've got on a tight budget, you can get those really cool LED ring lights to go around the camera that are often, USB powered. I wouldn't worry too much about, I think podcasting and video podcasting is great for building an audience off the podcast platform. It does create a lot of work, but for lighting, there are some really good affordable solutions. In I think like Amazon and those kind of websites sell these like light boxes. I really like the soft glow that you can have. Some you get some kind of influencers and creators will have just a really soft white glow where you can see the glint in their eyes. Those are often just $30-$40 soft box LED lights, or energy saver bulbs are in there, just in front behind the camera, or the kind of LED ring light around the lens of the camera. Those are often a really easy, cheap way to kind of get a really nice looking light that will just focus on the person talking. If you've got a multiple setup like this, where you've got 2 people in a room, that's not that's a bit more complicated. But I would say that just look at there are actually tons of resources and how-to videos about how to do different lighting setups and things. I can share some examples, but I think that usually it's just making sure that the people who are talking are kind of nice and balanced compared to each other, that the background doesn't draw attention from the people talking, and that you do it in a way that is also comfortable. If you're going to be talking for 90 minutes and you're using the kind of old lights that heat up and cook a room and everyone inside it, then it's thinking about the practicalities of that as well. So.
Awesome, sweet. And I know Troy sent that question in from Charlottetown. So a good local resource too for anyone in PEI is Film PEI. You can get a membership with them and rent out lighting options there. I'm sure there are different options in Fredericton and Nova Scotia as well. I just don't know them. But anyways, that's my little piece. The final question we have here before we wrap up is, what length would you suggest an episode should be?
Do you want to try and answer this?
There's no right answer for it. Because back to that, knowing your audience. If your audience is consuming podcasts on a commute to work, you have to figure out how long that commute to work is. It is a 45-minute episode. We've talked about like true crime that are solving complex stories can roll past that hour, and people are consuming it if it fits within how they usually consume it. The news ones that are 5 minutes apiece. So it all depends on your subject. What are you talking about? How long do you exhaust that topic? 2 is your audience. How are they consuming it? Where are they consuming it? What are they doing during that period? There's a Clayton Christensen that talks about jobs to be done, and it's applicable for all products, including a podcast. What job is that podcast doing for that particular listener? If it's educational, informative, it is until that message is clearly communicated. But really understanding that audience piece is, it's a moving target for us. We do a lot within that 15 to 25 minute space. But I don't know, I'm uncomfortable saying 15 to 25 minutes is the perfect amount of time, because that's not quite the right answer.
And my background is broadcast and TV, where like I was making TV shows and radio shows, and they were like, you have 29 minutes and 15 seconds, no more, no less. And that was a good discipline to get my mind into, because often podcasts do run a lot longer. They're not structured. They tend to be not as heavily edited as you would, be used to consuming audio on and video on other platforms. So I do believe that less is more sometimes, that just having recording for an hour and then editing out everything apart from the best stuff to 30 or 40 minutes only makes the show better. For me personally, there's no right or wrong way. I just feel like if it's over too short for people, have lots of episodes so they can keep binge listening. If they feel like, oh, I wish that was longer, they're more likely to listen to another episode rather than go, I finally got to the end of it in that sense. So it is important to cut it or record and have an episode that really sustains itself and doesn't overstay as welcome for people either.
Here, one more thing to that as well. Back to where people are consuming it. So if we're looking at, maybe your audience is on Facebook and are looking to consume it through Facebook. Facebook, I think, has maximum limits of 15 minutes for long form content. So leveraging that content for the platform and how people are going to consume it. If you're in an Instagram feed, you've got 3 seconds to make a connection, and then it's a redirect. So taking that content on those platforms and saying, if it's Facebook, let me recut it to 15 minutes for that max episode. Or if it's going to be an Instagram story, please don't be past 3 minutes. So understanding the audience, where they're consuming it, and that content. So I can't answer the question. It's such a moving target because there's no one right way to do it. I'm a fan of A/B testing, to be able to say I can put it on one platform and see what my audience, how they consume it, and do I get the response that I want? Did they go to the podcast platform? Did they go to the website? Did they consume more? Did they share it? All sorts of those KPIs and measures.
Awesome, sweet. Thanks so much. So that's actually the rest of our questions. And we have Rhys and Jon's contact info up on the screen there if you folks want to get in touch with them down the road. And yeah, just in closing, we have some folks here from all across the Maritimes. So feel free to get in touch with myself at Startup Zone, Sebastian over at Ignite, or Kelly at Planet Hatch to learn a bit more about how we can help you start your business and maybe your podcast. And yeah, hopefully you folks will be getting in touch with Rhys and Jon if you think that this is something you want to follow through with. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. Cheers.